Welcome to another CEO Wisdom podcast with Carolyn Bruin with us today. She's an executive coach, confidence coach, CEO, speaker, facilitator, and founder of Brain Powered Coaching. We're going to talk about leadership, neuroscience, mindfulness, and executive coaching today. This podcast is brought to you by my podcasting agency. It's called podpire.com. If you want to start, scale, or be invited to a podcast like this one, you can go to podpire.com and get some monetization into your podcasting world. Caroline, welcome to the podcast. Can you tell me a bit more about yourself and about your company?
Yeah, thanks, Charles. So I spent much of my time in around 18 years in investment banking, and that started in the UK. And then I moved to Australia, was there for 8 years, and then Singapore for 4 years back in the UK. And that's where I finished my kind of banking career as a chief of staff. And throughout my career, I guess what I saw time and time again was incredible people not achieve what they could do because they lack confidence. And although I did lots of leadership roles and roles, with some individual contributor pieces, it was something which was consistent across all of, whether it's levels of seniority or junior people as well. And so I trained to be a coach 8 years ago, and excuse me, December 2019, decided to leave banking and started my company Brain Powered Coaching 6 months later. So we focus on the neuroscience of confidence primarily. And it is such a rich topic that I think so many people, men and women, struggle with. And it's something that has taken us down the path of developing programs that we work with corporates and individuals to help them really shift and transform their confidence levels.
And wouldn't we think that in organizations like Deutsche Bank, you would find all confident folks, or is it kids that always had perfect grades and their parents kind of threw them into that career and then they end up being there without any confidence? What's the stats there?
I mean, it's an enormous organization, right? When I was there were over 100,000 people there. So I don't think you can kind of paint a broad brush over it. I think it depends on within the banking world, it depends on the kind of area which you're focusing on. I think from a front office perspective, so the trading and sales teams predominantly, you would be talking about maybe people who have a lot of confidence on the front. But what I've seen time and time again is that actually often that masks deep level insecurity. So what I'm noticing through a lot of the work that I'm doing, a lot of it has been focused on helping women with confidence, because that is something that I think women talk about, that they struggle with a lot more. Whereas I think actually there are a lot of men who struggle with confidence too, but they just don't talk about it. And so the way it shows up is bravado, is maybe attacking other people, maybe is that kind of environment that you're kind of alluding to, and therefore we don't necessarily see it. So banking has a whole range of different people. Operations is a huge part of what banking and what drives the banking engine, and that is a whole mixture of people too. So you get all sorts of pockets of different personalities within that.
Right. Yeah, I tend to fancy myself as someone with very high confidence, almost too much, but yet it gets triggered sometimes when I get hate online, and it shows up in the form of aggression and trying to reply why I should just not bother, right? That would be the mature reaction. Do you work mostly with men or with women? And how does, I mean, in the banking world, we tend to see way more men than women. What has been like your personal experience working at Deutsche for a while? Did you struggle with confidence yourself? Did you have that imposter syndrome?
So, I mean, there's a few pieces in that question, right? So, in terms of, for me personally, I had times when I struggled with confidence. One of the things which is a trait of imposter syndrome is it actually is context dependent. So you can feel very confident in one form, but then all of a sudden you're asked to be out of your comfort zone, and your confidence will completely change. So, for example, you know, I didn't have a very technical finance background. I was very good with people and leadership and solving problems and fixing things. But in terms of being a super finance geek who loved derivatives, that wasn't my gig. So if I was put into a situation where I was asked to be like that, I would feel a lot of imposter syndrome. So some people feel it, they may not feel it at all because they feel very comfortable in their roles. Others, so it may then just come out if, for example, they're asked to be on a board or present to senior management or something like that. From an individual perspective, what you're kind of alluding to in terms of that, you know, when someone triggers you, it can be, often that's values based. So we are all driven by values. They are our core fundamental driving forces. And if someone says, for example, you know, this is rubbish, you know, you don't know what you're talking about. If for you, your integrity is a very strong value, then that will massively trigger you. And that's where you can have, whether it's getting angry about it or upset about it, however that shows up for you, that's when that kind of response can happen. So often what I say to people is, if you feel like you're being triggered, have a look underneath and what is it that is actually really is bothering you about that, because it's probably values-based.
Sure. And when did your imposter syndrome surface in your years at Dutch?
So interestingly, I didn't have it at the beginning, because when I went into banking, I said, I don't know about banking, even if you.
Caroline, I
Oh,
think we're
hello.
back.
Oh, there you are. There you are. Where
Yeah.
did you get up to?
So yeah, interestingly, when I started, I didn't have it, and that part, and then yeah.
Okay, I'll start there then. So interestingly, when I had started in banking, I was interviewed, and I actually said, I don't know what an investment bank is, but I'll learn. And you know, they obviously saw something in me which they thought was fine that I didn't necessarily have that finance background. And so when I went into it, I could ask all the questions. I didn't have to hide behind a mask. And you know, this is what you have with imposter syndrome. It's a mask you're hiding behind, that you're something that you're not. I was completely upfront about it, but it was over time, as I was expected to know more, and actually I didn't necessarily have that background, that it came up for me. But there were times when, for example, in my chief of staff role, where I was really in my sweet spot, it was absolutely all the things I was good at. And so I didn't have imposter syndrome then.
And do you think like corporate breeds grounds for being fake, you know, and coming at work with some kind of mask and all happy face, you know, or am I wrong about that?
Depends on the corporate. So it depends. And I think this is one of the keys from a leadership point of view, is, are you creating an environment which is based on fear, which doesn't have psychological safety, and knowing the impact of that? Because people's brains actually will function much better if they're not running on fear. And it's all, you know, you only have a limited amount of energy you can use in your brain at any point in time. If you feel like you're going to get stabbed in the back, then you'll be using that energy from a fear perspective in that that fight, flight, freeze response. If the leadership create an environment which is based on positivity and support and challenge, it doesn't have to just be nice. It's safe to be me. It's safe for me to bring my whole self to work. Then what you will find is that you get much more cognitive processing. It frees up that the prefrontal cortex for thinking, you know, for problem solving, for strategic thinking. You don't have that in a situation of fear.
So when you get confrontation, you should just slow things down, take a breath, and then re-aboard the topic and the problem a bit later on when we're calmer. That is if it's not an urgency.
If you have the ability to do that, absolutely. Like you say, if it's not something which is a physical threat to yourself. So yeah, what I say to people is what you want is a difference in time between stimulus and response. Because if you have stimulus response, you're not thinking clearly, and that's when you lash out. But the more that we can have breath between the two, the more that you can actually, rather than reacting, you can respond. And then response comes from a place of being thoughtful and actually thinking, okay, what might be happening here? Is that response, is the reason I'm being triggered by this, is this a value being triggered for me? So you're able to then have a thoughtful response rather than something which is maybe more of the kind of red mist which might come up.
In terms of being a founder or a CEO, what would be the ideal brain state that you would like to put yourself in if you want to get focused? How do you get to that brain state?
So the number one thing for me is meditation, without question. You need to have some sort of meditative practice in your life, because not only does it mean that you are calmer, it's kind of preventative. So actually what meditation does, there's all sorts of benefits, from stopping you from aging quickly, to lower blood pressure, to less compassion fatigue, which is really important for healthcare professionals. But it also actually calms down your amygdala, and your amygdala is the part of the brain which is constantly scanning for danger. And so if you can, it means that you will be less triggered by things. So if someone says something to you that normally or in the past might have been something triggering, actually, if you meditate, you are much less likely to have that response to it, that reaction to it, I should say. And you have a response, you can have a much calmer response to that. So what that does, I meditate every day. I have done since I was in my mid-20s, because I had panic attacks when I was younger. And that started me down a path which I did not want to go down. And meditation completely saved me from that. And now it's something, even if it's 5 minutes a day, ideally it's 10 to 15 minutes. Some people will do more than that. For me, that's what I enjoy. And I really notice the difference in terms of my cognitive bandwidth, my ability to deal with pressure, how positive I am, how much I can take on if I'm meditating.
Right. Okay. What about if you're heading into a meeting with someone that is difficult? How will you prepare yourself for that interaction?
Well, so what's interesting is that we actually, the way that we function is that we, as humans, don't like conflict. And so from a conflict perspective, it's all to do with whether or not we're part of a tribe. And so we want to be accepted, we want to be part of a tribe. So conflict can be something which triggers people both from the perspective of it being the receiver of that feedback, and also someone giving it. And so if you're going into a situation, you're thinking, oh my goodness, how is this going to work? How am I going to deal with this person? It can be, you can have the same physical response as the person receiving the feedback, which actually is very triggering because you have a negativity bias. So you tend to remember the negative parts of it. You hear the negative parts of it more. We hate being out of control. And so when we're going into a situation, maybe we're giving feedback where, in a conflict situation, we feel out of control. That actually triggers the part of our brain so that it goes into a survival response. So the energy in our brain is moved to the back part of our brain, and we're not using our prefrontal cortex. So therefore, actually, we're not thinking clearly. And we also have that tribal piece as well. So if you're going into a situation which might be a difficult one, you have all of these different things being fired, which can then mean that you are, it can be very triggering from even your sympathetic nervous system gets activated, and you have a full fight freeze response. So what can you do? I'd go back to the mindfulness piece. I would always go back, and as much as possible, you want to have preventative measures in place. But so there's some really simple breathing exercises you can do as well. There's something very interesting called the physiological sigh, which was developed by scientists at Stanford. And it's the same principle that we use for kids when, kids will naturally do it if they're upset. If you talk to them and, if they're upset, they'll have a process where they are breathing in through their nose repeatedly and exhaling through their mouth. And this is what the physiological sigh is. You take 2 breaths in through your nose and a long exhale. And what that does, it actually communicates between your diaphragm and your brain that you are calm. And what it also does is get oxygen into your system faster, because the alveoli in your lungs, which are the little bags which transmit oxygen through to your bloodstream, they open faster, a bit like a balloon when you blow it up. So something as simple as the physiological sigh can really help you in terms of when you're going into that kind of situation.
Right. And tell me a bit more about like the type of clients you work with and who you target. In terms of target, the type, the industry, the title, and typically what you charge them, what kind of package you work with.
So I am at the moment, I have been working with the Bank of England. I've been working with Google, a few of the big banks, a global institution in Australia, an institution based out of South Africa called Life Healthcare, but they're also a global healthcare. So there's no in particular, there's no specific industry, but what I would say is confidence impacts everyone. In terms of charging, that completely depends on packages, on what they want, on what kind of whether they want all sorts of things from an annual perspective or a specific program. So that completely depends.
Right. And how do you get in touch with them? Like, what kind of marketing do you use to get clients?
Predominantly, it's all my network. So aside from the Bank of England, who found me via LinkedIn, it's been all via my network that I have found people, or they have found me. Because the thing is that the confidence question is something which is asked time and time again. I think it resonates so much with different people. So when I talk about what I do, a lot of people step into that versus when I used to work in derivatives, which people used to kind of yawn and walk away from it.
Right. And what are your goals for 2024?
2024 is, I'm working on that at the moment, actually. I'd love a 50% rise in our sales, which I think is absolutely possible. And I'm also bringing on more coaches who can deliver my programs as well. And I have an online course as well, which I will be looking to grow, as well as a book, which I've got one book which is coming out this year, which I've contributed to, and then my own book in 2024.
Cool. And what challenges have you faced this year, and how did you surmount these?
Challenges. I think as an entrepreneur, you're always facing different challenges because you're always learning. There's different things like trying to unpick what on earth the algorithms are with the different platforms. How do you make sure that you're speaking the language of your customers? And when you do a launch, how are you making sure that is successful? So I guess the biggest challenge is accepting failure and accepting the fact that you're just always trying and failing and learning, and as long as you do that, then you'll just keep going. You need to just not lose the faith.
Any comments on what happened at OpenAI last weekend?
I'm definitely not an AI super geek, but really, I think it's really interesting in terms of I'd love to know more about the culture at that company. I think it's really interesting how there's been such an uprising that that someone has been ousted, obviously a massive misjudgment on the part of sounds like a relatively inexperienced board. But yeah, I think really I'd love to know more. I'm sure there'll be some Harvard papers on it at some point, in terms of what kind of culture created that fact that the whole company said, if you're, we're all leaving if he goes.
How can you find empathy with these individuals that orchestrated that failed coup, when it seems that it's straight out of an idiot's movie, the decisions that they made?
You know what I've learned over the years is that there's always context with stuff. So that's why I guess why I'm a coach, is because you ask lots of questions. On the whole, my experience, people don't do things in terms of being just to be Machiavellian, and sometimes it's ignorance, and maybe that's your point about being idiots. But and as someone on a board, you really should have the knowledge to be able to make the best possible decisions. But my first place would be understanding why, because if you've made that decision, it's a very big decision, and why on earth would you make that lightly?
It's a good way to put it. Where can people find out more about you, Caroline?
So my website is brainpoweredcoaching.com, and I'm the same on Instagram and Facebook, or I'm Caroline Bruin on LinkedIn.
I was Charles Cormier as your host for another CEO Wisdom podcast, and Caroline Bruin.